And we're on the air. Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Codementor Office Hours. My name is Mark. This is your first time joining us. Basically, what we do is we get together online with some of our favorite tech experts to try to do a deep dive on a topic that is maybe challenging our community or is just sort of brand new to the landscape. And we've been spending the past bit of time pretty heavily focused on the JavaScript framework options. And today we're kind of focus on another aspect of that as well. And a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our guest. If you are joining us in the live room, looks like a couple people are starting to pop in. You can throw questions into the group chat this whole time. We'll add them to the queue and hit them at the end. And if you're watching the live broadcast from Google+, there's a little blue Q&A app. It can be a little hard to find, but if you send questions in through that, I'll see those, and I'll try to represent those when we wrap up. But without further ado, our guest today is Sam Selikoff, who is a front-end engineer at TEDTalks, that is. Formerly a graduate student of economics, he unexpectedly discovered his love of programming while doing data work for a consulting firm. He's passionate about JavaScript, data visualization, and economics, and he's joining us today to walk us through testing in Ember, the solutions that are available, and why he made Mirage and the problems that solves. So please welcome Sam.
Hey, Mark. Thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, like Mark said, I'm an engineer at TED, and we have a few external sites, but we also have a suite of internal tools. And for this suite of tools, we basically are now using Ember across the board. Something that came up just as we were trying to standardize our front ends was coming up with a solution for getting these front ends tested in kind of a sane and consistent way, in a way that all of our engineers could jump in between them and know exactly how to create new tests or what API endpoints each of these apps expected and used. And so this is kind of the motivation for some of the problems that I've been working on. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here and walk through this presentation. Can you see that all right?
Yep, looks good.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about this project called ember-cli-mirage, and this kind of came out of some of the work that we've been doing. The main problem here is, you start a new Ember app, and you're writing it out, and you get to a point where you need to interact with server data. And so a lot of times people will add or update their actual application code to put in some dummy data just to get started, just to kind of give you a sense of what the app will look like if a server actually existed and it returned data. And this is a really kind of like a duct tape solution, because you don't want to leave this code in your application code. And so the next step kind of is to use some mocking layer that mocks out your server if you don't have one while you're developing. And so this is kind of at a high level. The problem is basically, whether you're using Ember or really any JavaScript framework, you need to have a way to simulate a server while you're developing and testing your app. So the possible solutions, there's basically three. The first one is that you can proxy to an actual API. This API could be like a local development API you're running, let's say a Rails server, or you can actually, with ember-cli, you can proxy to an API that's running on a different domain, like, for example, a live hosted one. So that's one solution. Another solution is to write client-side mocks. So these are mocks that run in the browser. And then the third solution is using server-side mocks. So not proxying to a real API, so you're still mocking out your API, but it's something that's run on a server, let's say your development computer, like a Node server or Rails server. But these are mocks, which means that they're not the actual server code that will be deployed. And so let's just run through each of these solutions and kind of their pros and cons. So when it comes to proxying, the pros are that it's authoritative. So you're using the real API that your Ember app is going to be hooked up to. And so this means you know that the data you're working with and the way that the data is going across the wire between your Ember app and the server is how it's actually going to work in production. And there's no extra setup involved. If the API already exists, you don't have to, as a developer, worry about how to get this set up. You just proxy your app to that API, and you're good to go. You can start developing new features. Now, the cons is that basically the API must exist or it must come first. A lot of times when we're building out new apps, we don't even know completely the API endpoints that our app needs, because we'll write the app and do some user testing and change things around, and that kind of influences our API design. And so this is one of the cons of using proxying, is that you really have to have this API already. And sometimes it's not even a possibility. Sometimes you make an Ember app that talks to an API that you don't have control over, and so it's just not always an option. And then again, you have less control. Even if you do, if you own the API, being able to see what happens in many different scenarios, and like validation failure scenarios, or with different sets of database data, it's just harder to control sometimes. And then it's also can be hard to set up with testing and a CI server. So if you're trying to automate your tests, your acceptance level tests, and they talk to a real back end, this just involves some extra steps to get your CI server up and running, because now instead of just running the tests on the client, you have to make sure the server is working and make sure the state of the database is set up in a way that your test expects, and then hook those two together. And it can be done, but that's just one more step to get it set up. So the next solution is client-side mocks, and again, there's some libraries like Pretender.js or jQuery mockjacks, or this is the approach that Mirage takes as well. Mirage is built on top of Pretender, but basically these libraries they intercept the JavaScript environment's XML HTTP request object, which is how your Ember app makes AJAX requests. And so whenever your Ember app makes an AJAX request, instead of actually going through the browser and making a real network request, it goes through this dummy object. And this dummy object lets you define routes to intercept the requests and then return your own mock data. And so this all exists in the client, and basically your Ember app never leaves the browser. So one of the big pros here is you have really complete control over this. You can change how the routes respond. You can change the data that they use, or you can try different validation states very easily because you have complete control over it. It's also portable, so once you have your client-side mocks written, you can run automated tests from your Ember app, and you can run them anywhere because the mocks will exist in the client right alongside your Ember app. And so this is nice for getting it set up in like a CI environment, or just having a new developer be able to pull down your repo and be able to run all the tests immediately, or start defining new mocks immediately. And it's also nice, sometimes what we do is before the server is written, you can actually put a copy of your Ember app on a public URL and share it with the stakeholders of the project, and those client-side mocks will still be there, and so it makes your whole project very portable. Now, some of the cons of using client-side mocks are essentially as soon as you start duplicating, as soon as you start mocking your API, whether it's on the client or the server, you have a duplication problem, and you run the risk of those mocks falling out of sync. Now, at the end, we're going to discuss some possible solutions to this problem, but this is absolutely an issue that comes up whenever you're doing mocks. Second is CORS requests, simulating the core other origin requests that your Ember app might make to, for example, like a YouTube or Twitter API, or even other domains within your own systems. Can be difficult, whereas if you use a server-side solution, the server can kind of proxy those out very simply, and so that's just something else you have to deal with. And the cons for doing client-side mocks on your own, kind of from scratch, are that there's really no conventions. Like when you build a server API, let's say in Rails, your team is a team of Rails developers, and you guys have conventions and ways of setting up a server where when you start mocking out things in the client on your own, like you're just going to kind of start diving into it. People tend to do this, and that can lead to mocks that are kind of unwieldy, spaghetti code, and this is also one of the things that Mirage tries to solve. As far as the server-side mocks go, again, this is not proxying to your actual API. This is mocking out your API, but using a server, and this is like something that you would do with ember-cli mocks. Ember-cli comes with the ability to generate server mocks with a simple node server, and those get served up while you run ember-serve, while you're serving up your normal client app. So you have control, the same control here that you have in the client-side mocks. You have the added ability to proxy very easily. So if your Ember app needs to get data from other origin sources, you can do that very simply here. And in some sense, they're more powerful. There's more idioms and there's more libraries that are suited to developing real server APIs in the server land, whether it's Node or Rails or whatever. And so, in some sense, you can create these more simply in a real server environment than if you were doing client-side mocks. You have the same problem on the client in the server as you do on the client of duplicating your API and running the risk of having those two fall out of sync. And then you also have this lack of conventions potentially. And the server-side mocks, while they're more powerful, they make your app as a whole less portable, and so you still have to go through this extra step of setting up your CI environment, let's say, or setting up a new developer to get them to the point where they can start developing and testing your app. So as we kind of were experimenting with different possibilities, like Mirage kind of came out of some of the conventions that we landed on, and Mirage essentially uses client-side mock. So it's built on top of Pretender, but it brings along some conventions to try to make each project look more similar than just writing a script on your own from scratch. So like I said, it uses client-side mocks, brings along conventions, like it has a database as part of it, but it's just a very lightweight client-side database, but this kind of gives you some more flexibility over different mocking scenarios. And then at the end, like I mentioned before, because we are doing client-side mocks and we're mocking on our API server, you do run the risk of your mocks falling out of sync with your actual API, and therefore your acceptance tests maybe give you false positives, because your acceptance test will tell you that your app's working, but that's actually only true if your app is hooked up to this fake server that you've written, which is now not representative of your real server. So this is a real problem, and something we'll talk about at the end. Now let's just jump into a demo of how to actually use Mirage. So can you see the code right here?
Yep, looks great.
Great. So this is just a brand new Ember project. So I literally just typed in Ember new Codementor Mirage and then CD'd in here. I just didn't want to do it live, so I didn't have to wait for NPM to install all this stuff. But let's go ahead and open this in Sublime. And if we just run the server, again, this is like out of the box what happens. You start serving Ember, and then you can come over here to the browser and see welcome to Ember.js. And so that's being served up right here. But this is kind of a brand new project. And so what we would do is, let's say we want to display, let's say we want our index to say a list of contacts right here. And so we'll say here's our contacts. And so normally what you would do here is something like each contact and model. And let's just display their name. Now, of course, if we save that, we come back here, we look at the template, we see it's changed, but there's no contacts, and that's, of course, because we haven't requested any data. So the way you do this in Ember is we would go to the route, and we'd create an application route. And then what we do is define a model hook. And here what we want to do is say the model for the application is all of the contacts that we have on our server. And to do this, we also want to create a actual contact model. So we'll use Ember's generator. We'll say Ember generate model contact. This will create a file for us here at models contact. So now if we come back to the app and we refresh, we'll see we get this error. And this says it tried to make our GET request to localhost /contacts, and it was 404 not found. And that's because we don't have a server running. And so this is where you basically start writing your mocks, and you could either proxy to your real backend, or you could do one of the options we discussed. What we're going to do is use Mirage. So we'll come over here and we'll cancel the Ember server. we'll go ahead and install Mirage. We do that with ember install ember-cli-mirage. Now this will go to npm and it'll pull down the package. Ember-cli-mirage is an Ember add-on, so it installs just kind of like with this one line, and it pulls it into your ember-cli app. It'll actually run some generators, which will create some of the scaffolding for you. The Mirage stuff all lives under app/Mirage, and that's kind of where your server definition goes and where you can create some mock data for your routes. And so as soon as this finishes, we'll see just finishes, and we see it runs the generator, creates these files. Now we can come back to our project, and we see at Mirage, here's the config. So this is kind of like where we define which routes we want to define for a Mirage server. And it kind of has just some, like a cheat sheet for how to do different scenarios. We'll go ahead and delete these comments. And we see we have factories and fixtures as well. So first let's talk about fixtures. So what we want to do is we basically want to say, given these two contacts are on our server, now when our Ember app makes a request to /contacts, this is what it's going to return. So this is how you add data to your Mirage database. You basically just export arrays of POJOs right here. So we have these two right here. Notice this file is called contacts, and so that's going to automatically add it to the contacts table of our database. And then all we want to do is say, so now we have, this is it, Mirage is running. And so if we come back and we start our server again, we'll see once it builds, we refresh here. Now we have a new error. Before, remember, it said our browser tried to make a GET request to /contacts, but now we see Mirage has hijacked the AJAX request object, and it tells us that our Ember app tried to make a GET request to /contacts, but that there is no route defined to handle this request. Define a route that matches this path in your Mirage config file. So this kind of tells you like which routes this app actually needs. And because it doesn't have one right here, it just gave us that error. And so what we do right here is we say this.getContacts, and this is all we have to do, because in this case, we really just want our server to return the array of contacts. And so this is what's called a shorthand. It's just like a really simple way to do these conventional routes in your app. So we write this.getContacts and save this, come back, and we see, let's look at the logs here. We see that there was a successful request to contacts. It returned us this array, and now we have these two objects. And we can look in our Ember tab, we can go over to data, and we can see there's two models right here in contacts. But these only have an ID attribute, and in Ember you have to define your attributes on the model. And so here, let's come back to the model and give it a name, because we remember the actual fixtures data has an ID and a name. So we'll just come to the model, tell it that it has a name, which is a string, save that, come back here, and now we can see the contacts. And so now our app is, this is nice because our app is exactly how it's going to be in production. It's just that we have this mock server running, and now we have complete control over how the data works. And so I can just come here and change. We can add a third contact, let's say. Save this, and then you'll notice also it's nice because it automatically refreshes, because again, Mirage is in our Ember app, it's all client-side, and so it's all very portable, it's all held within the app right here. And so that's kind of how you do your development. So you can create additional tables by adding fixture files, you can create more routes, you can do, let's say we wanted to create, have a route to create a new model. So let's say a new contact right here. We'll go ahead and create an input field, and so we'll look here and we'll say create new contact. And so we want it when the user types in a name right here and clicks create contact, we want to actually update our database, our Mirage server. And so what we'll do here is in Ember you do action, create contact with the new name. We'll come over to our route, and we'll define an action, create contact with new name, create a contact with a name of new name, And then we'll save that. And saving that is going to actually contact our database. And so now if we type in Sam and click Create Contact, we'll get that error again. Mirage, your Ember app tried to post to contacts. Doesn't have that route. So we'll come here and add this .post contacts. Save that. Oh, sorry. Actually, before I do that, you'll notice that it did update the list right here. It updated the list, and this is a lot of people do this when they're creating, because when you create a record, it actually creates it on the client. But if you look in the inspector right here, we'll see this fourth contact with the name of Sam has an ID of null, and that's because it hasn't been saved. Because in Ember, you create a record on the client, and then you call save, and then the response from save from your server has the ID for the record, and it needs to generate that ID. This hasn't happened yet because we don't have the route defined, but it's not good to leave it like this during development, because if you look at flags, we'll see that this record says is dirty is true, the ID is null, and so the record, even though it shows up in this list, it's not really in a consistent state, and this can you can run into bugs while you're developing this. You really want to have the record representative just of what it would be like in a real server environment. And so what we're going to do is just create this new route, this .post contacts, and this is also a shorthand, and this is going to just do what we expect it to. It's just going to use whatever data we give it and create a new record in our contacts database. So now when we come back, we can see, if we run this again, create contact, there we have an ID. And we can even do things like this .timing. We'll say that there's a delay of 2 seconds before it saves. Now if we create again, and we look, we'll see the ID is null, but then it becomes 4. And that's when the server actually responded. And this lets you have a lot of control during development over what your UI should look like if the server's taking a long time to respond. See, in this case, in this app we have right here, we showed the list right away, but maybe we shouldn't show it until the server actually confirms it's been saved. Or maybe we should have it a faded opacity and pop in once it's really saved, or we can even see what would happen if there was an error. And so this is some of the nice things that Mirage gives you, and in general, client-side mocking gives you. Just a lot of control over your server's responses, and it makes it really easy to experiment with different UIs. We could also come here really quick just to finish this and add a delete contact action. So we'll add just a button next to each one with a little X. We'll define a new action, delete contact. And this is going to be contact.destroy record. And again, if we just do this without implementing the Mirage route, it'll remove it. But again, we have data in an inconsistent state, and then we have the Mirage error. So what we're going to do is just create the new Mirage route, this.delete, and this one is at /contact/ID, which is exactly how our real server would do it. You would send a delete request to /contact/2, let's say, save that, come back here, and now if we click delete, it says it successfully deleted the second contact. And so now we have essentially a mock server with a lot of the functionality that we'd expect. So that's kind of the basics of Mirage. That's during development. Now I want to talk about testing. So here we have, when we load this application, we have our fixtures defined, and we have these 3 contacts. Now, some people are tempted to just go into their acceptance test and say, okay, I just want to write an acceptance test for this route and say, let's make sure that the 3 contacts show up. The problem is that these 3 contacts are just hard-coded into our fixtures file, and as we kind of develop this app more and more, this will undoubtedly change. We'll add more data here. We might change these around. We'll add relationships. And so tying the test to this data is not the smartest thing. What we really want is to be able to say within our test, given 3 contacts, here's what we expect the UI to look like. And so Mirage has a way to do this. This is where we use factories. So first, let's go ahead and create our test. So we're going to say ember generate acceptance test, and it's going to be just the contacts test. We'll generate that. We'll open that up down here. So Slash should show a list of contacts. We're going to visit the index route. And then let's go ahead and pause test here and look at this. So let's visit, let's start the server again. And then we'll visit our test runner. We visit our test runner with /tests. And we've paused our test here in the middle of our test, and so we can see this is the state of our application. And so we can see contacts shows, but we don't see any contacts here. So that's kind of weird, you might think, because we have those fixtures defined. Well, in testing, Mirage actually ignores your fixtures. And this is why we don't want the data that we are asserting on in our test to be tied to that fixture file. Since that fixture file is really far away from the test and it's kind of brittle, it might change a lot during development, we want to have our own way to define data. So the way we do that is with factories. You'll see here the generator that ran when you first installed Mirage also created this factories folder, and it created a contact factory for us. You can create more factories just by adding more files here. A factory, for those of you who don't know, is just a simple way to generate data. And in this case, we're using it to generate these fake database records for a Mirage server. We just export this mirage.factory object, and a factory just has attributes on it. Our model only has a name attribute on it, so let's just give it that. And what this means is every time we create a record from this factory, it'll add it to the contacts database table, but then it'll use this name as well. So let's just come to our test, and the way we do this is we use server.createContact. That'll give us one contact. And so now if we come back to the test runner, it refreshes for us automatically, and you can see right here, there's Pete in the list of contacts. And you can see the application works just like we would expect. And so we can create a list of contacts. We could create 3 more here like this. Now we see 3 Petes. We also have a create list, which is a simpler way to do this. We want to create a contact. We want to create 5 of them, let's say. We come back, and there we see 5 of them. And we can also do dynamic attributes on our factory. So instead of just having each contact called Pete, maybe we would have it called contact 1, contact 2, and so on. So we save that, come back here, and now we see a list of these contacts. So this is really nice because it gives you control over the data in your test, which is what you want. You want your tests to be intention revealing. You want them to explain to people working on the test later, to you yourself looking at it later, what's the purpose of the test. And this is really telling us that once we have, it says given 5 contacts on our server, once we visit this route, we expect to find what? We expect to find 5 paragraph tags. So we're going to find all the paragraph tags, get the length, and expect there to be 5 of them. And so now let's come back here, and oh, there's 6. I guess because of we have. Let's look at the template and see. So we use another paragraph tag. So let's call this. Let's give it a class of contact. So now we expect to find 5 elements that have a contact class, and we can see that that's working. And so that's kind of that's the idea behind factories. So that's the basic demo of Mirage. It lets you. So notice that even though we can mess with our fixtures and change them during development, they don't affect our tests. But the routes that we defined here, those are all loaded up during our tests. And so this is the nice thing that it gets to share these across development and testing environments. So that's basically the gist of what I wanted to go over for the demo. Let's come back. Can you guys? Just want to make sure you guys can still hear me and see me and everything.
Yep.
Great. So let's just wrap up with just some kind of closing thoughts about some of what we've talked about. So there are some improvements coming to Mirage. Managing IDs is always kind of annoying, and if any of you are familiar with some of the factory solutions and other server-side frameworks, a fully functional kind of factory solution usually makes it so developers don't have to manage IDs. And so by IDs, I mean, like if we look in our fixtures file, we had to give these contacts IDs, And if we had to start doing relationships between models with our factories, we'd have to pass around IDs. And that's not ideal because it makes your test more brittle, and you really don't care about that. From a test perspective, you really don't care about the ID. All you care about is I have a contact, and let's say that contact has 3 addresses. And so right now you have to do this manually. It's not too much work, but it is annoying, and that's going to be something that's going to be improving in Mirage soon. Relationships are also tricky, basically for the same reason. And so there's soon going to be a way to just create a related model without too much work. Right now, traditionally in servers, you have a layer that fetches data, and then you have a serializer layer which is responsible for turning that data into your JSON response. And that could change based on a lot of things. It could change based on different routes. Like you could return a user model from multiple routes, but you might want one route to serialize it one way and one route to serialize it a different way. And we want to make reproducing this kind of behavior in Mirage really simple so it's easy to replicate your server logic. And so we'll add a serializer layer soon. And we also want to add the ability to mock out WebSocket responses. So this whole demo we showed how to mock out HTTP requests, but a lot of Ember apps also connect to WebSockets, and that's something we should be able to mock out and test as well. And I've already been experimenting with that and have a solution working. It's just a matter of kind of tightening it up, but that'll be really nice to have as part of Mirage too. And then we'll do some nice things with fake data, so bringing in a faker.js, which is a JavaScript library to give us fake address numbers or names or birthdays, and make it feel more like during development, get your app into a state that's closer to the actual way it will look in production. And then just to wrap up, this problem of falling out of sync. So essentially, this is actually not a problem that's unique to Mirage or mocking APIs in general. The problem that as we start to mock out our API, and now the API that we're testing against is no longer implements the same interface as the API that our server actually has. This problem is not particular to Mirage, it's general, and the general problem is in testing, whenever you start writing test doubles and making fake objects that implement a similar interface as other objects so that you can use them to test your objects in your unit test or your acceptance tests, you run this risk where as soon as you write a double, it's potentially that soon it might fall out of sync with the actual object that it's standing in for. Now there's 2 solutions that we can think of for this problem. One is that you have an interface test. So in typical unit testing, if you were to write a double so that you don't have to have the entire object graph there, what you would do to prevent them from falling out of sync is you would create a new interface test, and you would say this both my test double and the object that it's standing in for implement this interface. And so you would create that interface. Let's say it responds to these 3 methods, which is all we care about for the purposes of the double. And you would make sure that that test double implements that interface and that your real object implements that interface. And now, if your real object ever changes its interface, it won't pass that interface test. And now your test will no longer give you false positives because you know both of those objects will be implementing the same interface, or your test will fail if they don't. So this is a good way to prevent this from happening, to prevent your test doubles from falling out of sync with the objects that they're standing in for. And we can think of some ways to do this with Mirage too. We have nothing concrete. This hasn't been super high priority yet, but thinking down the road, you can imagine, okay, as soon as we mock out our server, we're saying, and even looking at the code, you can say the interface that our Mirage server now implements is these 3 routes, right? It responds to these requests to these routes, and it returns data in a certain way. So you can imagine writing an interface test for the server. It has nothing to do with your Ember app. It's just an interface test that says, given these contacts, when someone makes a GET request of this URL, these contacts are returned in this way. And you could imagine also running that interface test against your real API. There's a couple ways we could think about doing this. I don't want to go into too much details now, but at a high level, this is kind of one possible solution to this problem. The second possible solution we've thought of is to actually have the Mirage server proxy back to the real server. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at this acceptance test we wrote, we see we have this method call right here, server.createListContact5. That went to Mirage's factories. It created 5 objects. It inserted them into Mirage's database. And then when the Ember app visited this route, it hit the Mirage server for the list of contacts. Now you can imagine switching Mirage into a mode.
Sam? Hey, Sam? Guys, it looks like we might have lost Sam. Let me send him a quick ping, see if he can come back on. Yeah, looks like Sam got disconnected. I just sent him a message to rejoin, so just give us a couple seconds. Hey, Sam? Sorry, guys. I think Sam is having some internet problems, so we might have to wrap up. But I'll be sending out an email. Oh, let's try this one more time. Hey, Sam?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey.
Sorry about that. My ISP has been having some outages here, so I think they're back on now. I'm not sure. When did it cut off? Towards the end?
Uh, you were in the middle of explaining one of the pieces of it. You were still screen sharing the Sublime editor, and then I lost audio.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to wrap up with the last couple points, and then we can try to hit some questions. Sorry about that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, it's no one's fault. I can definitely screen share again. I think I'm on. It's not going to happen again because I was on a 4G connection and now I'm back on the actual internet here.
Okay.
So where should I pick up?
Maybe like the last few parts in the editor, wherever you left off in the editor, we'll just use that as a jumping off point to get back into it.
Okay. Here, let me screen share. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Do you know if I had written the tests yet and gone over that?
I think it was just before that. Why don't we just back up a little bit from there?
Okay. What about like the delete part of this list, like being able to create contacts right here?
Yeah, let's pick up from there. That looks good.
Okay. Okay, so let me just go ahead. I'll just undo some of this and go over this again. So, okay, so let's comment this out. So here we have, I'm not exactly sure where we left off, but if you remember, and it seems like I've done this, you can just holler. So here in our template, we're just going through the list of contacts. And I just made the point that usually at this point is where you start mocking. And so we installed Mirage. And Mirage is going to let us, so it starts out with this empty config file. And it creates these two directories for us, fixtures and factories. So once we have this set up and we have a normal route here in Ember, let's go ahead and comment these out as well. And here we're saying when our application loads up, we want this route to return all of the contacts that we have. And if we just run this and go to our browser, we'll see Mirage gives us this error message. And it says, your Ember app tried to get /contacts, but there was no route defined to handle this request. And so this is Mirage telling us that our Ember app is making a request. We see that Mirage, because it's been installed, has kind of hijacked the Ajax request object in the browser. And now it's saying, I'm getting this request to /contacts, but I don't know what to do with it because you haven't told me what to do yet. And so this is because our config file here in Mirage config is empty. And so the way we do this is we just say this.get/contacts, and this is going to define a route for us. And it's going to use the contacts that are in our database. And the way you add contacts to your database is by creating fixture files. And this is the one that was created here by default for us. It's just an array of objects with ID and name. And so now if we come back to our app, we can see, I'll just comment this out as well because that's the second part. We can see that this list of contacts is showing. And this is cool because now we can just update this fixture data. Let's say we can add another model here. And then if we save it, we come back, the project will refresh. Remember, this is all in the client, so we don't have to restart anything else. And we'll have our data right here. Now, this is just a GET request, but we can also show creating a new contact. This is pretty easy. Here we have new contact. We'll have an input, and then we'll have this button right here to create. So we look at our template. We want to fill this out and click Create, and then have it actually create a contact. So this we see is sending out this create contact action. We'll come over to our route and then just create this method right here, create contact, which takes the new name from the input field. And then it's going to call store.createRecord, passing that name, and then it's going to call save. And call save is what we want to do in our actual production application too, because that's what sends it over the wire to our server. If we do this now in our development app here, type in Sam and then click create contact, we'll see it added this thing this name right here, but then we have this error as well. The error says your Ember app tried to post to /contacts, but there's no route to find. And even though it shows up in this list, if we come to our Ember inspector, go to data, go to contact, we'll see that here's our new record. It doesn't have an ID, and that's because in Ember, when you create a new model, it creates it on the client, and then once it saves and gets a confirmation from the server that it was saved, that's when it gets the ID and it populates that field here with the data from the server response. And so even though some people develop like this is not really a good way to develop. Like, you want your data to be consistent, and this could introduce bugs later. So this is why we want to use Mirage and actually save this data in our fake database. And the way we do that, we come back to this config, and we just say this .post/contacts. And this is the default. What this does is just takes the request body from whatever data we send over. In this case, we just send over the name, and then it adds it to the contacts table. So we save that, we come back here, now we type in Sam, click create contact, and we look over here and we see the new contact has an ID of 4, and then also flags is dirty is false. So that means it's saved. And we can also do change the timing here. Timing is one of the options you have in your Mirage config. Let's change it to 2,000 milliseconds. If I save that and refresh, now if we look at the data tab, we create a contact here. Click create. We'll see it's null, and then in 2 seconds it gets that ID. And so that's simulating a longer response time. And that's really useful during development to kind of help you with designing your UI in a way that lets the user know what's going on. And so this is one of the big benefits of doing client-side mocks, is you have this control, and it really lets you, gives you the flexibility to design your UI to handle all sorts of situations. And it's a very low barrier to changing how your server responds to give you that feedback. Finally, we can do a delete action. We'll just add this button for delete contact right here for each contact, and then we'll write an action in our route that just calls contact.destroyRecord. We'll come here, we can see the X, we can click on it, and it says your Ember app tried to delete/contacts, but there's no route to find. So we'll come here and define a new route, this .delete, and then we want to delete /contact/ID, just like our real server was. This is basically a delete request to /contacts/1/2, whatever the ID is of the record. So if we save that and come back here, now we can delete, and we see that these are successfully deleted. So this is pretty, not a lot of code for kind of a simple CRUD server here. And so, yeah, this is the basics of getting Mirage started. The last thing I want to talk about is testing. So here we have, when we load up this app, it loads these 3 data models from our fixture file. Now, in testing, some people are tempted to say, okay, let's go ahead and write a test for this, an acceptance test. And we want to say, when we load up this app, let's make sure that we have 3 p tags here, because we have these 3 contacts. The problem is the fixture files are they're kind of far away from our tests. They're right here. And these fixture files tend to change a lot too. During development, undoubtedly we'll add more models and we'll add relationships. We might want to change how many models we have here, and we wouldn't want those decisions to break our tests if the tests are still working the way they should be, if they're still, if that part of the app is still functional. So in Mirage, when you write a test, you don't actually use the fixture data, you create factories, and that lets you set up your server state right within the test. So let's look at how we do that now. Here, I'll just make sure I'm still connected, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the way we do this, first we'll stop our server. I'll go ahead and delete the old one. And we run Ember generate acceptance test, contacts test. I created this file for us. And now we say, let's visit our index path right here, and then let's just go ahead and pause test to look at the app. And then we can start the server again, and then come to our browser, and then let's go to the test runner at /tests. If we do this, we see our app being rendered right here. This is running the test right now, and here's the app. And we can see contacts and new contact, but we don't see any of the data. And again, that's because Mirage ignores the fixtures. So how do we get data into here? Well, first, we come over and we create a factory. This was created for us by default. You can create more factories just by adding more files under this directory. And for those of you who don't know, a factory is just a way of generating objects. In our case, it's an easy way to create our fake database records for the purposes of tests. And so when you define a factory, you give it attributes, and these attributes are used on the actual object itself. So if we pull up our contact model, remember, we only gave it a name. So let's just remove these other attributes, and then we just have a factory here with name of Pete. So each object that's generated from this factory will get inserted into the contacts database table, and then it'll have a name of Pete. So if we come here, the way we do this is in our test, we say server.create contact. We save that, and we come back to our test. Now we can see Pete in our contact list. And so that's how easy it is. We could create a few more like this. Each one of these is named Pete, and we see there's 3 of them now. There's also a method that lets us create a list of contacts. Create list contact, let's say 5. Save that. Now we see these. And instead of making them all Pete, we can actually also use dynamic attributes here. We'll just have a function that returns contact 1, contact 2, and so on. So we'll save that. And now we can see our contact list in our test has our 5 contacts. And this app works just like normal, like we would expect. But for the purpose of this test, what we want to say is, given 5 contacts on the server, once we visit the app, then we expect there to be, and in the template here, we gave each contact a class of contact. And so we'll just find all the contact elements, and then we expect there to be 5 of them. So let's save this, come back to our test, and our test passes. So this is how we can use Mirage to create fake data in our tests. And this is good because now we can, when we come back to development and adding features, we can mess with the fixtures file, we can change this, experiment with it, and it won't mess with this test at all. So basically, all of the routes that we've defined, all the server configuration in our config file are shared in our test environment, but the data is not. And this is what gives us flexibility, and it makes the test more isolated, more atomic, and also more intention revealing. The test is saying, given 5 contacts on the server, when the user visits the route, he should see these 5 elements. And so this is more closer to what we want to do in acceptance testing in Ember. Okay, that's it for the demo, and I just had a few points at the end to make sure that am I still on?
Yep.
Great. So just a few closing pieces after the demo. Some improvements that are coming to Mirage. Managing IDs and creating relationships is kind of like somewhat of a pain point in Mirage right now. As you saw in the demo in the fixtures file, we had to create our IDs just like they would, just to mimic what would come back from our actual server in the response. And this is kind of annoying. In other more mature factory solutions in server-side frameworks, like Factory Girl for Rails, for instance, the developer usually doesn't have to worry about managing IDs, and I think that's a really good thing because, again, it's not important for the substance of the test. The test is really saying, given these resources exist, this is what the UI should look like. And so there's some improvements coming to make it so that we don't have to basically manage these IDs at all. And also, once you start getting into relationships, let's say a contact had many addresses, in the test, you'd have to pass around the IDs to make sure they're related, but we'll have a way to create a related entity simply without having to manage the IDs. So that's kind of a big thing that's coming in the pipeline for Mirage. We're also going to have a simple serializer layer, and traditionally in server, when you're writing a web server, the data you return from, let's say, your controller isn't necessarily the data you want to serialize and send as a JSON response to your JavaScript app. So usually there's a serializer layer, and that lets you have more control over which data you want to return based on which route. And we're going to have something similar in Mirage because we want it to be easy to mimic that out in your Mirage server. And so a serializer layer will let that be a lot easier. We also want to give the ability to stub out WebSocket responses. So far, Mirage has been focused on stubbing out or mocking out HTTP requests, so that when our Ember app interfaces with the server over HTTP, that's what we've been mocking out so far. But a lot of Ember apps also speak to a WebSocket backend, and so Mirage is soon going to have the ability for you to queue up WebSocket events that will be emitted when your application loads, or different things like that. And then also we just want to make it generally easier to create a lot of fake data, maybe using one of these, like there's a library, JavaScript library called Faker.js, and it brings in fake first name, last name, ages, birthdays, addresses, and this is just going to be one more thing that makes it easier to get your development environment more similar to your production environment of your app. And then finally, just a note about your Mirage server and the potential of that server falling out of sync with your real API. And this problem is actually not unique to Mirage. This problem arises whenever you start writing test doubles for your real objects. So traditionally, let's say in a unit test, if you're unit testing a business object you have, that business object might have dependencies. And sometimes instead of using the real dependencies, because they're complex and instantiating that entire object graph is not feasible or not a good idea, that puts too much knowledge in the test, what you do is you write a test double. And that test double implements the same interface as the real object, but very simply and for the purposes of the object under test. So that object under test just needs a double version of that other object, not the real thing. So that's where your mock comes in. But as soon as you do that, that mock that you've written has the potential to fall out of sync with the real business object. And you could have the same problem that you do with Mirage, namely, you now have a unit test that's based on this double. If you later change the interface of the real object, but you forget to update the double, now you're going to have a false positive. You're going to have a test that tells you things are working when in reality they're not. And they're not because the interfaces have changed. So one solution to this is to have an interface test. What you do is, as soon as you write a double for some object, you write a test that makes sure both the double and the original business object implement the same interface. And you would just maybe have that as a module, and you would include that module in both objects. That way, if you ever change the interface of the original object, this interface test would now fail, and you would know that you'd have to change your double, and that would possibly lead to more changes in your system. But that way you know your test suite is not actually lying to you and telling you things are okay when they're not. So the way this might work in Mirage, you can imagine, if you look at the server that we just wrote in the demo, Mirage config, this is essentially the server that we wrote. And essentially you can think about this from an interface perspective. We can say, what interface does our Mirage server implement? Well, it implements get request to /contacts. So given contacts on the server, an HTTP get request will return them in this so-and-so format. Or a post will have this effect, or a delete will have this effect. And this is essentially the interface. So we haven't, we don't have any particular concrete examples of this yet, but our thoughts are that you could write a simple interface test that says, okay, given two contacts, a get request should return this data in this format. That could be a separate JavaScript test. It has nothing to do with your Ember app. It's just testing the interface of your Mirage server. And you could run that against your Mirage server, and then you could run that same interface test against your real API. And the way you would do that is you would have some special testing controller that this interface had access to and could use it to set up the state of the server in order to assert against it in these different scenarios. So again, there's some talk there. This is not a super high priority for us right now, but this is one way that you could solve this problem and ensure that your Mirage server and your real server kind of stay in sync with each other. The other option is we could have Mirage proxy back to your real server. And here's how this might look. So if we pull up the test that we wrote, you'll notice semantically this test actually doesn't know anything about Mirage or doesn't know anything about the fact that there is a client-side server. Semantically, it's saying exactly what we want it to say, which is, given that there are 5 contacts on our server, contact resources, this is what we would expect. And so you can imagine switching Mirage over into a mode, telling it about where your actual server lives. Let's say it could be either a locally running version or some hosted version somewhere. And again, having some kind of testing controller that Mirage has access to, so that when you run your acceptance tests and call server.create or server.createList, Mirage is actually going to just send that data through, the data from its factories. It's going to, instead of inserting it into its own database, it's going to send it to your actual server. Your actual server will use that data to set up the state, and then when you get to this line, visit slash, and your Ember app makes a GET request to slash contacts, Mirage will again proxy that through to your real server. And so you can imagine this would be a really lightweight way to just have your suite of acceptance tests run against your actual API, and that way you could have like a sanity check that your Ember app, the API is actually what you expect it is. So that's just another idea that we've had of how to avoid this problem of your Mirage server falling out of sync. But so far, this hasn't been a super high priority for us, and we've found the benefits of client-side mocking to vastly outweigh this problem. This problem, basically, you can manually take care of it with a bit of diligence, but it would be nice in the future to have this also be automated. So that's it for the presentation, and you can find out more about Mirage at ember-cli-mirage.com. And yep, that's it for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. That was great. Unfortunately, we've run a bit over time, so I don't know if we're gonna be able to take questions live today. But is it cool if people send you some messages if they have any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. On Twitter or yeah, Twitter is probably the best place.
Okay. Cool. Well, I'll send an email out to everybody who RSVP'd and who attended with links to some of Sam's work and some more information about Ember testing and things like that. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Sam, for the great presentation. And again, this will be available on the Codementor YouTube channel, so definitely feel free to review if you missed any part of it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right.